Every 80 years or so, America walks into a fire. It's not a recession. It's not a bad election. It's a crucible, the kind that decides whether the country survives at all. We're standing at the mouth of one of those historic rendezvous right now. Two historians that I've always been fascinated by, Strauss and Howe, look back across 400 years of our history, and they found a rhythm. About every 80 years, roughly the length of one long human life, 4 generations of 20-year cycles, the nation hits what's called a winter. They call it a fourth turning or a crucible. Now watch how it lines up. In 1776, the Revolution, 13 colonies, betting everything against the most powerful empire on earth, moved forward about 80 years, 1861, the Civil War, 600,000 dead, maybe more, and the Republic nearly torn apart. Another 80 years, and we have a global crucible, 1941, the Great Depression, the Great Second World War that swallowed up the whole planet. Now do the math, Strauss and Howe did, and you'll see that back in 1997, when they wrote the book, they were looking at the next rendezvous with the crucible being around the year 2025. Now you can hear that two different ways. You can hear a clock ticking down towards doom, or you can hear something else entirely. Because if you look at who stood in each of those fires, whether it was Valley Forge or Gettysburg or Normandy, every one of those crucibles was carried by a generation that never really asked to be born for a storm, but they somehow had the spiritual DNA in them to be a hero generation. They weren't cursed, they were called. So here's the question I want to sit with this week. If history really runs in seasons, and if there really are discernible cycles in the American prophetic pattern, and winter always comes, then winter's never once had the final word. Spring always follows. So let me show you how God's moved by the very hinge of our own history again and again and again, in a discernible rhythm. We're going to get into all of that in a moment when we come right back. Hey friends, I'm working on a project at home late at night. You know, I can always tell when God's in it because I get energy doing it. This 29-day devotional that I'm putting together is for you. You and I can cover every single day from July 4th to 29 days later, the amount of time it took for them to get all the signatures on that Declaration of Independence. And every single page that I've got in there is an insight on what the guys wrote and why they wrote it and how it applies today. I also have a coin, a special commemorative coin for the 250th. And this coin is to remind you and me that we stood together during this pivotal year, the year when history had a hinge. We were there. It's going to remind you to pray, remind you to be in the Great Awakening, and remind you that you are connected to a whole bunch of us that are standing at history's moment to see America go into a Great Awakening. Get the 29-day devotional and get that commemorative coin. Go to lancewallnau.com/America and join me on this very anointed discovery journey. Let's take a look at the spiritual moral backbone of what America has always had. John Witherspoon was one of the signers of our Declaration of Independence, and he was a Presbyterian minister. And he also was the president of Princeton and the only clergyman who signed the Declaration. But he was the mentor and the personal tutor to James Madison, who was so indispensable in the shaping of not only the Constitution, but the Bill of Rights. He's the living bridge between a branch of theology that's called Reformed theology and the American constitutional thought. It's proof that that founding, that declaration, was far from an only secular endeavor. The Black Robe Regiment is another group that I've always been intrigued by. Colonial pastors preached the revolution from the pulpit. In fact, the British blamed the pastors and the pulpit in America for inflaming the people into war. Peter Muhlenberg is said to have finished a sermon, thrown off his clerical robe, stood there in a Continental Army uniform, and took that robe off and said, "There's a time to preach, and gentlemen, then there's actually a time to fight. This is the time to fight." And that Black Robe Regiment was so called because he wasn't the only clergy that felt that they had preached about America's calling and they had to show up and do something about it. Patrick Henry, you might remember him, the fiery patriot. He had a will that was kind of interesting. He's the one that said, give me liberty or give me death. But his last words wasn't political. He wrote in his will, I have now disposed of all my property to my family. There's one thing more that I wish I could give them, and that's a Christian religion. If they had that, and I hadn't given them 1 shilling, they would be rich. And if they didn't have that, though I gave them the whole world, they'd be flat poor. That's interesting. You don't ever necessarily think of give me liberty or give me death as the utterance of an ardent Christian. And I talk a lot about, if you've seen the movie Great Awakening with George Whitefield, it's hard to imagine how God used him catalytically, though he never spoke about war. What he did was he had united the colonies in one outpouring, and the spiritual vitality that he had put into the nation had created the shared experience so that the hearts and minds of the people were ready for God to do something and to make the faith sacrifice necessary for it to happen. Whitefield, I think, had a second influence that most people miss. He was rejected by the organized Anglican clergy of his day, so he had a kind of an attitude towards organized clergy, the high church, many of which in the Anglican community were more sympathetic with Britain because the Anglican faith was, in fact, the faith of the Church of England. And so Whitefield produced a kind of, how shall I put it, a sanctified rebellion in the spiritual aristocracy of America that says just because they are making us preach outdoors and they tell you don't go to my meetings, but they are dead and God is alive. And so he positioned in the DNA of the American spirit this idea that you don't have to kowtow and subordinate yourself to the aristocracy of the elite. And this really fed that American sentiment when the British were insisting that the colonies were acting like upstarts and they better start behaving like children with a patron father. And Whitefield had put something into the spiritual fiber of America that says, no, you're just like those uppity clergy over there in the pulpits that don't believe in the common man and that we can hear God also. And Whitefield put that kind of spirit into the common man. John Adams makes an excellent quote. You've heard it often, but I do think it's worth hearing again. He said that this nation, this Constitution, our form of government, our experiment, was made only for a moral and a religious people. He said that in 1798. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Because if you're not willing to voluntarily rein in your appetites, if you're going to just go frothing at the mouth with an Antifa-like rebellion every time you don't like something and raging on the street or, dancing in your bikini underwear down the street, flaunting your right to sexual, whatever you want to do. He said the anarchy of a pagan culture is never going to be restrained by voluntary submission of the people to the highest good of their fellow man and to participating in government. There'll be anarchy. Everyone will do what is right in his own eyes, and the system will fall apart. Washington's farewell address is also very important, and the religious section of that is worth looking at. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, Washington said, look, it's religion and morality that are indispensable supports. Read that paragraph straight from Washington, and you're going to realize that his calling for faith and morality is the call to say they're the load-bearing walls of this republic. It's really like a prophecy. When you take out faith and morality, as so often the left and secularists want to do in America, well, you're removing the load-bearing wall in the whole system. All $36 trillion worth of its debt collapses. And that's part of the concern that we have. I want you to see that These folks understood something. When this government came together, it had its threats. Let me go to 1791. A thing called the Whiskey Rebellion. We had a problem all the time. The problem was trying to pay off debts. And to do that, Alexander Hamilton said, you got to have a strong central government. You need a banking system, and you need to have some form of taxation that can develop the means of giving us solvency as a nation, so that we can do trade and we can show that we're economically self-sufficient. So where do you go to get those taxes? Well, you got to go somewhere. So Hamilton came up with the idea of a whiskey tax, which the farmers felt was unfair because in their case, they had an interesting situation. They got crops, and the crops were corn and rye and grain. But the problem with they didn't have refrigeration, they didn't have trucking, they didn't have roads. So the shipping of their harvest east as grain was a risk because of transportation, roads, storage, and the stuff could go bad, and therefore they lose money. But they found out that if they distilled that grain into alcohol, well, they could ship that, and it doesn't matter how long it takes or whether it's hot in the summer or frozen in the winter. That harvest going east will make them a pretty penny. So they weren't focusing on perishable grains. They focused on the whiskey. The problem was, once they got that whiskey going, the government saw an opportunity to tax it. And right away, these same farmers, again, said, will you not get off our back? We're trying to survive, and you're taking our profits from us and making us pay. Well, they rebelled against it. By 1794, the protests became so violent that nearly 400 whiskey rebels near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, set fire to the home of the regional tax collector who was in charge of the Pittsburgh region. Washington and Hamilton saw it again. They said, like Shays' Rebellion, this is a serious threat. These people we have to find a way other than armed and violent disruption of courts and taxes. So Washington organized a militia of 12,950 men. And he rode them out with himself back in his uniform at the head of an army. And as he had hoped, by the time he had reached Pittsburgh, the rebels saw 12,000 of these guys with Washington. They thought, it's not worth it. We're not going to be able to beat him anyway. So they dispersed. But 150 of them, that were the leaders, the ringleaders, were arrested, tried for treason. But they didn't have really good evidence because, it's one word against another, and there was no videotapes and cameras, and they had legitimate grievances. 2 men, John Mitchell and Philip Weigel, were found guilty of treason, but both of those symbolic culprits were pardoned by Washington, because Washington very shrewdly said, look, I'm not trying to make martyrs out of these guys. I'm trying to find a way to have centralized government and people that don't rebel violently. So by 1802, Thomas Jefferson, who didn't like Hamilton anyway, just repealed the whole whiskey tax. But these things are, it shows you that our country hasn't always had a journey that was without challenges. In 1783, the soldiers, officers included, were so frustrated with the fact that the war was ending with Britain, they hadn't been paid. They could see that they might never get paid. So they had a private meeting. And in that meeting, some of these officers who were very high up even in Washington's army said, you know what, we're not going to disband. If we disband, they're never going to pay us. I say we stay. We either threaten to disband so that they have no army, and then who's going to protect America? That would be one form of a union organizing. It's like early unions. Or maybe even better, we don't disband. We just march on Congress. See what they think when the thousands of us are standing out there in front of them with muskets saying, when are you going to pay us? Well, Washington was still the head of the army. He knew he had a problem. So 1780, Congress passed a resolution providing half pay for retired soldiers, However, as of 1783, the states had yet to comply, and because they had no strong centralized government controlling everything, Congress was asked to raise the revenue through taxes, but those local state legislators said, "The heck with that. You guys go ahead and vote whatever you want." But in Maryland, in Virginia, in Georgia, we're not going to be paying you guys extra money. So they had a problem. Come right back. I'll tell you how they solved it. Hey, friends, I'm working on a project at home late at night. You know, I can always tell when God's in it because I get energy doing it. This 29-day devotional that I'm putting together is for you. You and I can cover every single day from July 4th to 29 days later, the amount of time it took for them to get all the signatures on that Declaration of Independence. And every single page that I've got in there is an insight on what the guys wrote and why they wrote it and how it applies today. I also have a coin, a special commemorative coin for the 250th. And this coin is to remind you and me that we stood together during this pivotal year, the year when history had a hinge. We were there. It's going to remind you to pray, remind you to be in the Great Awakening, and remind you that you are connected to a whole bunch of us that are standing at history's moment to see America go into a Great Awakening. Get the 29-day devotional and get that commemorative coin. Go to lancewallnau.com/America and join me on this very anointed discovery journey. So 1783, Washington's own officer corps is meeting in private and discussing how they're going to get their money. George wasn't invited to the meeting. He was perceived as, well, he had sent them a notification asking them to refrain from inflammatory addresses and to remember that they are soldiers and that they have a glorious reputation and not to tarnish it. But that didn't stop them. Washington gave general orders and declared the impropriety of meetings like that. He wanted 4 days for them to wait until cooler heads could prevail. So March 11th, he gave the order, just wait 4 days before you guys pick this subject up again. He was searching for an answer and a solution. On March 15th, they still gathered, still hot. And it was General Gates that stepped forward to chair the proceedings, one of Washington's high generals. However, he was shocked that while he was conducting their meeting on whether they should march on Congress or what to do, Washington entered the room unexpectedly, uninvited. And he asked if he could be permitted to address the meeting. Now, who's going to tell the general, commanding general, you can't talk? So Washington went up and gave them a speech that's now known as the Newburgh Address. He promised that Congress would ensure their pay, that he said, from a full conviction of its merits and sufferings, it will do complete justice. He said, I'm promising you that. And they grumbled, the old man means well, but they haven't done it yet. He urged those gathered to give one more distinguished proof, for them to give one more distinguished proof of their remarkable patriotism by being patient. Just demonstrate the virtue. You've got so much glory on what you've accomplished. Don't tarnish it now. And he said, look, I got a really great letter I want to read to you. It's from a congressman in Virginia named Joseph Jones. Now, history wonders whether Washington had planned this in a crafty way, the old gray fox would, or whether it was spontaneous. I rather think he knew what he was doing. He realized that his appeal to them to not tarnish their reputation, don't take up arms against your government. My gosh, the whole revolution was to prove that we could govern ourselves, be patient. And it didn't constrain them. So he takes the letter out and he starts to read it, and he brings it close to his face and he hesitates, and the soldiers are looking at him, because Washington was never a compelling orator. He wasn't a Patrick Henry. He was a Virginia statesman, and he had some restrictions even with his teeth. The contraptions that he had for his teeth made it uncomfortable for him to do public oratory. But he was having to show up now, and the boss had to do something. He has to use his leverage with these men that have been with him in hardship for these 8, 9, 10 years together. And so he says to them as he takes his glasses out, and there's a mumbling. They'd never seen the old man wearing glasses. He never let them see him frail. And he heard their twittering back and forth about, what's he doing? He said, gentlemen, as you can see, I have not only, along with you, grown gray in the service of my country, but in that same service I've become nearly blind. And he focused his glasses so that he could read the letter, haltingly, word by word, from this congressman saying, we intend to make good on our commitment. But it didn't really matter, because the men that had been with this proud general who behaved himself with such dignified bearing, for him to show himself frail, to make reference to the fact that he's getting old and that he's gone through a lot and that he fears that he might be losing his sight. It was too much for some of these guys who, they were angry at Congress, but they weren't angry with George. And some of them, it says, they kind of wept the realization that the old man, he's got a point. Let's give him another shot. And the rebellion dissolved right there. It's a curious thing how the slender thread of chance and just a moment of a mood shift, and maybe the wisdom of a strong man letting people know that he is also weak, was enough to move his men. But that's exactly what happened. And the rebellion ended. And where are we now? Well, we're at that period of 1783. And that is the mutiny that was quelled by Washington. But you see, you notice a pattern here. We had a problem for a long time, shaking money out of the people without people feeling as though they were not being properly represented. After all, we went to war over taxation with Britain, and now the colonists are all getting taxed. It's like you could see where they're saying something ain't right here. But these are the stories that I wanted to share with you. We come to the next shocking discovery. I should have known this earlier. But in the election, Adams, of course, follows Washington. Adams has his own problem. And his own problem is that this is when they're still having difficulty with determining what to do with France and Britain. But the division of the nation, this current division we have now, found its genesis, actually, in what I almost find a betrayal of trust. And it's a strange thing, because these are the great men that are over here on this, mural behind me. Jefferson was having problems with Hamilton. And Hamilton was for a strong, centralized federal government. He just felt that, listen, man, we're 13 colonies, but we ought to have a military that represents us from a continental army. That's the only way we could defeat the Brits. It's great to have these state militias, but we need a unified government. We need a banking system with a unified currency. We need to have some form of taxation so that revenue can come in, so that we can honor our debts and begin with that banking to leverage money in order to invest and increase trade. And Hamilton had brilliant ideas. He had been with Washington as an aide de camp and a personal lieutenant of his from the war all the way to Yorktown, where he got a chance finally to lead one incursion against a fortification, because he kept begging Washington to put him into battle so that he could have some experience before the war was over as a patriot in combat, and Washington let him do that. So Hamilton was trusted by Washington, and I think Washington had a tendency to agree with Hamilton as a general, that we do need a strong, almost like the military. We don't want a monarchy. We're not going to go to Britain. We got to have the people decide who leads, and let the people vote, and let the people have a vehicle of government that expresses what they want. But we can't have anarchy. You saw Shays' Rebellion. You saw the Whiskey Rebellion. We can't have different parts of the country just tearing apart and leaving each other. And so the the 1800 election comes around, and you have Jefferson, who during the days of Washington's administration did something that I found was really subversive. He began writing and funding with the government payroll without Washington even knowing it. Jefferson tapped into some money in order to create newspapers that would be criticizing Washington because he didn't like Hamilton's influence on Washington. And so Washington was tormented by division on the streets, kind of like we have today, because the newspapers were being used on purpose to subvert Washington's administration by complaints and leaks that were coming out in the press. In Washington news, somebody was betraying him. It was Madison and Jefferson funding the press to expose and attack Washington, their boss, the father of the country. But Jefferson was a guy who was all about making sure the states had their autonomy and their freedom as much as possible from the threat of a weaponized federal government that would be just like England all over again. So there's a philosophical battle going on there. When it's time for the election, Adams wants to be able to get a second term. Adams wants to run. Jefferson doesn't want Adams to win because he thinks he's too much under the Hamilton influence. And so Jefferson hired a scandal writer named James Callender to brand John Adams as a hideous hermaphroditical character. Hermaphrodite. A hermaphroditical character. Adams' men warned Jefferson would burn Bibles. This guy's Antichrist. He'll import the guillotine. He loves the French. He's an anarchist. He's not for us. And so the presidential election of 1800 pitted Jefferson and Aaron Burr, representing the Republican Democrat Party. He was a strange hybrid, representing the states people, against those Federalist people. And on that ticket was John Adams and Charles Pinckney. Never heard of Charles Pinckney before, but that was the guy who was going to be running along with John Adams. It was believed that Adams he was hoping that he would end up being president and Pinckney could be his vice president, but they had a convoluted system back then. They hadn't quite figured out how the Electoral College was going to go, and they found out in a hurry, if it doesn't set itself up right, you got a mess. Guess what they ended up with? Well, Adams got slaughtered because of the negative press that Jefferson has succeeded in launching against him. So they ended up with a kind of a runoff that has Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied for president. So the guy who's supposed to be his vice president ties him for president. And now Jefferson thought, well, Aaron stepped down. And Aaron said, maybe not. Maybe I should be president. So here's the problem. Every Republican voted for Jefferson and Burr. So they were tied with 73 electoral votes each. Jefferson thought that Aaron should just step down. I mean, the agreement was, you're going to, you be vice president, I'll be president. But Aaron Burr refused to step aside. And that put a real rift in their relationship, I'll tell you that. So Burr never declined to say he wanted the presidency. So they kept on revoting, and they voted and voted, I guess like 36 times. And what happened was his sworn enemy, Alexander Hamilton, remember, Jefferson hated Hamilton. The sworn enemy, Hamilton, says, you know what? I got a lot of problems with Jefferson, but basically he's just an intellectual with ideas. But Aaron Burr, now there's an ambitious man I don't trust. So Hamilton persuaded the Congress, which the vote ended up going into the Congress, where Federalists actually dominated. They could have put whoever they wanted in. They could have flipped it over to Aaron Burr. But Hamilton said, don't. Let's not do that. Give it to Jefferson. He's more trustworthy than Aaron Burr. And so they threw the election to Jefferson. And who did it? Alexander Hamilton. And by the way, most on the 36th vote, they finally had Jefferson. That's how close we came to chaos right away. A divided country couldn't even get the first election after Washington and Adams figured out. But most of these early history, that's what happens with countries. They end up with coups or assassinations or revolutions or civil wars. That's the normal course. But America passed that test. Unfortunately, Aaron Burr never forgave Hamilton, and that's why in 1804, in a duel, Aaron Burr killed Hamilton because he never got over how Hamilton defeated him in that election. We'll see you again on our next episode.
250 years ago, 56 men risked everything to declare a truth that still shakes the world. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that every human being is created by God, endowed with unalienable rights. They pledged their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor. Many paid in full. For 29 days, Lance Wallnau walks you through every phrase, anchored in Scripture, applied to your generation. This is not a study about rebellion. It's a study about stewardship. Will you be found faithful with the inheritance you've been given? Honor America's Christian Foundation. Get your devotional and commemorative coin at lancewallnau.com/America today.
Did you enjoy this latest episode? Please remember to share it with your friends, because the more knowledge you have, the better equipped you are to navigate the world.